Thank you, Mr. Brown. Good afternoon, everyone. So excited that you're here joining us today for our Finance and Appropriations Committee with Columbus City Schools. We have a fairly robust agenda for today planned. I've been having a little trouble pulling it up on my computer. Mr. Treasurer, if you could just tell us what those agenda items are, please.
Certainly. The first item on the agenda is approval of your minutes from the last meeting. Then we'll do the monthly financial report for May. I'll have an update for the committee on some assumptions underlying the 5-year forecast. Mr. Gooding will go through a discussion about the upcoming temporary appropriations resolution for fiscal year 21. He and I, hopefully more he than I, will go over a discussion of some upcoming transfers for 2 enterprise funds, and then we will adjourn the meeting.
Thank you very much, Mr. Treasurer. If we could take the roll at this time, that would be awesome.
Mr. Brown?
Yeah, if I could find the mute button, I'm here.
Chairman Cole?
Present.
Mr. Green?
Here.
Ms. Johnson?
Here.
Mr. Jordan? Mr. Miller?
Here.
And Board Member Ragland?
Here.
You have a quorum.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Treasurer. If we can start off with our first agenda item, that will be great, but let's first approve the minutes. Is there a motion to accept last meeting's minutes?
I'll move approval.
Second.
Moved and seconded.
All right, Mr. Cole?
Yes.
Mr. Green?
Yes.
Ms. Johnson?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Ragland?
Abstain.
And Mr. Brown?
Yes.
That motion carried.
Thank you, Mr. Treasurer. We now may move forward with our first agenda item. Let me continue to try and pull this stuff up here.
All right. The first agenda item this evening, or this afternoon, is our monthly financial report, which I'll bring up for all of you to view. All right, monthly financial report for May. This report will be presented to the board next week on June 16th at their next regular meeting. With revenues coming in about 11 million over plan this month, it dropped that year-to-date variance back to about 7 million under plan, or about 1% overall year-to-date. Expenditures ran almost 8.6 million under plan for the month. That increased the favorable or under plan variance on a year-to-date basis to just under 26 million, or about 3%. When we take a look at the highlights for revenues, state aid was about 2.1 million under plan this month, and that reflects the start of the reduction in state aid. As you, I'm sure, have heard, and I think I mentioned to you at the last meeting, the reduction in state aid is 9.2 million. That was to be spread over the last 2 months, actually the last 3 payments of the year, 1 payment in May and then 2 payments in June. Each payment is around $3 million. So the 2.1 under plan reflected that $3 million reduction in 1 payment. And otherwise we would have been around 960,000 over plan. Before the reduction, we were expecting to be over plan the last couple of months of the year, but now we'll run under. But it all worked out mathematically. So, but it does reflect that 3 million reduction. We should end the year about 21 million under plan, and part of that is the 11.8 in student wellness and success funds that we had thought were going to be in the plan for the general fund, but they're in a separate fund. And then this 9.2 million that was reduced from our aid here recently. Property tax allocation came in this month and wiped out the unfavorable variance from last month. So we're running, as I had indicated last month, about 2.5 million over plan year to date, and that's the way that line should finish. Other revenues came in under plan, a fairly substantial amount, 3.4 million, and that's related to an expectation of a Medicare reimbursement, which is usually several $1 million. And that should just be a timing issue and rectify itself. Sorry, going in the wrong direction, rectify itself in June. Graphically, you can see property taxes very close, but under plan, state aid under plan, and then all other revenues. When we break that down a little bit further, you can see that the bulk of that is in that other revenue, and you know those are pilots and interest income and other miscellaneous items that have perennially been running above plan. You look at the variances. State aid being the largest dollar amount, unfavorable. Other revenues being the largest favorable amount. And changes from last month in terms of magnitude, the only thing is the restricted federal grants jumped to a high percentage, but understand that's about 250,000. And again, that's the reimbursement for the QSCUBIs or qualified school construction bonds. And we should get that in the month of June and work itself out. So no other, and then property tax allocation, because it came in, that variance dropped from high to low, and it switched to favorable because it's running about 2.5 million over plan. We get to personnel, about $1 million under plan this month, mostly in the area of benefits. As you can see here, salaries and wages, it's pretty, I mean, it's right on target. It's only 257,000 off of plan, and that's just 0.07%. Benefits running under plan about 3.1 million, or almost 2%. Again, we're going to recode about 11.8 million in June over to the student wellness and success funds, and so on a year-to-date basis, that will increase by that amount as being under plan. Purchase services is back to running under plan this month, about 2.1 million. And as you can see here, it's now almost 16 million under plan, close to 11 million due to purchase services and 5 million on charter. Understand too, the charter will run a little bit further under plan because they too were subject to a reduction in as part of the overall K-12 state aid funding reduction. Timing issue with transfers. We had them in for May, but as you know, on this agenda, we're going to talk about some transfers, but all those transfers will be executed in June. So that variance should reconcile in June as well. Graphically, you can see personnel indistinguishably off. It's right on target. Small variance in charter. Other expenditures, you can see here, the purchase services is the largest contributor to the under plan variance. The purchase services represents about 42% of the total dollar variance, but only 6% of our overall expenditures. Whereas when you look at personnel and charter, they combine for only 30% of the dollar variance, but 90% of our expenditures. So they're just interesting comparison. So on personnel and charter, when you combine those two, on 90% of all of our expenditures, we're within 1% of our plan in those categories. Again, just a graphical representation of our variances. You can see that in dollar amount, the orange bar for purchase services stands out, and many of the larger percentage variances are in some of the areas that are smaller portions of our overall budget. The only change here is in other uses, which jumped to a high percentage, and that has to do with the transfers. One thing I did this month that I included in the management discussion and analysis is a discussion and some numbers on the impact that the closure has had on our expenditures. Because from the get-go, there, a lot of folks were asking, how much are you saving by not being in session and not having schools open? And for most people, they expect that, we would see some, significant reductions in those operating expenses. However, that we're a personnel business, and that's where most of our expenditures lie. And we remain to pay the vast majority of our staff because we continued to work, even though it was maybe not on site. We did continue to work remotely. So I began to look at the data period by period, and have several charts for you here, as also in the written report, to try and take a look at what's the data tell us about what's happened since the closure, and can we kind of make a cause and effect assumption about the relationship of any change in expenditures. This isn't a real fine analysis, but it's very much at a macro level. I'm looking for large movements in these numbers. So I start with salary and wages in total. And the periods on the left-hand side, since this comes out of our accounting database, it's periods 1 through 11. Period 1 is July, period 11 is May, for your reference. So in my analysis, I drew a line after period 8, which was February. And I wanted to see in the data, was there a change in the increase over the prior year, just as an indicator of maybe the closure has caused a change in that behavior. So looking at the grand total, you can see that for that 11-month period, we're about 3.3% above last year's expenditures. And just in a very, again, macro level, if we had a 3% increase in the base and we had steps involved in there and some new positions, you would expect it to be more than 3%. The steps can run close to 2%. So you'd expect it to be more than 3, but less than 5 is kind of how I was looking at it. On a grand total basis, it looks pretty reasonable, a little low than my expectations might be. But then when you break it down and group period 1 through 8 and compare that to the grouping of period 9 through 11, you see something dramatically different. You see that period 1 through 8 is running about 4.1% above last year, and that makes sense. That sounds like a good number given what I know about the base increases and steps and additional positions. But you can see in period 9 through 11, it slowed down, and instead of being 4%, it's 1.5, just under 1.5%. So the next question is, where are those salary and wage savings, if you were? What slowed down? And you all could probably pick a category or two that you would suspect would slow down. All of our regular employees continue to pay, but we continue to pay. But there are some pay categories that slowed down or came to an end. And what I did was pull out what I think are the obvious ones, substitutes and overtime, and did the same calculation, looking at periods 1 through 8 versus periods 9 through 11. And I was pretty excited about the data, because the data, as I looked at it really the first time through, supported exactly what one might expect to have happened. Subs and overtime dropped off dramatically. You can see that during the year, that expense wasn't all that much higher than what we spent last year. But you can see in periods 9 through 11, which is March, April, and May, it dropped off dramatically versus last year. But when you look at all others, having pulled out the subs and overtime, interestingly enough, periods 1 through 8 and periods 9 through 11 aren't any different. They're both running about 4.3% above last year. So this all makes sense in terms of looking at what the impact of that closure was. So overall, looks like at least here in salaries and wages, if somebody would ask us, have you saved, quote unquote, saved anything? My answer would be probably in the 3 to 3.5 million in terms of salaries and wages for subs and overtime that we have not incurred related to the closure. Moving on to purchase services. If you get down and you look at the comparison of the periods 1 through 8 to periods 9 through 11, that's not a dramatic difference to me. And things are really erratic when it comes to comparing to last year. You can see anywhere from minus 2.1% to a jump of 13%. In this particular case, again, because I'm looking at it kind of at a quick and dirty macro level, I felt that perhaps maybe the metric of comparing to last year wasn't the best metric for determining whether or not there was a change in expenditures due to closure when it comes to purchase services. And there really wasn't a line item in purchase services that made sense to me that would say, gee, kind of in personnel, it would make sense, subs and overtime. Yeah, that probably should go down. In purchase services, I couldn't come up with a category, and the data didn't lead me in any direction. So I went ahead, though, and took a look at breaking them down the way we typically break down purchase services, and that is pull out community schools, scholarships, and College Credit Plus. Pull that out and look at just purchase services on its own. And you can see here that it did, in fact, slow down somewhat from the previous period of time. It was running about 7.4% above, less than last year. Now it's only running about 1.5% less than last year. But again, those changes from last year are so erratic that I didn't believe that it truly represented a cause and effect. And quite frankly, I didn't look any further in purchase services to try and determine if there was really something going on relative to the closure. I just felt like I didn't have a very good metric for that. But I did go on and look at the charter category, objects 478 and 479, and you can see that they've been running pretty true to form. It's a lot more consistent. And one would expect, though, that the deductions, they really weren't affected during this time period. A little bit in period 11, as I mentioned, the state aid reduction. But here, this was a very consistent increase over the prior year, and consistent with the fact that those deductions went on regardless of the closure. So in the area of purchase services, I didn't really see much of an impact after the closure. When we get to supplies, though, this is dramatic from the get-go. As you can see that in overall through period 11, we were around about 15% behind, but in the first part of the year, just barely under where we were last year. But since the closure, especially in April and May, there's been a significant drop off from last year's expenditure level. I dug a little bit further into that, a little bit deeper, and found that the vast majority of that, let me go back here for a minute. So we see that it dropped about $2.4 million versus last year. The bulk of that, or 2.2 million of that drop, are in four categories. Sorry, general supplies, operation and maintenance supplies for buildings, maintenance and repair supplies for vehicles, and fuel. I can't tell you how many times people ask me, boy, you must be saving a whole lot of money in bus fuel. It drove me crazy. Our bus fuel budget's around $4.5 to $5 million. And so to be really, really significant to me, I'd have to save almost the entire budget. But in any case, it was one of the top categories. So all but about 550,000 of that $2.2 million drop from last year is attributable to these categories. The largest two are general supplies, pardon me, at about 694,000, and the infamous fuel at about just under $1 million less than last year. for that 3-month period, March, April, and May. So all in all, when I look at what the impact the closure may have had, that we could attribute reductions in our expenditures to the closure, get about 3 million in personnel, perhaps another million in benefits tied to that 3 million reduction, 2 million in supplies roughly. So you get about 6 million overall in reduced expenditures as a result of the closure through the end of this fiscal year. So I just thought I'd share that. That was my analysis to get a feel that yes, some expenditures are down, and we didn't see any dramatic increase in other expenditure categories. So just my quick analysis to take a look at that. I don't anticipate that any of these savings will carry forward into next year. In fact, when we think about opening next year and the plans that we're working on there, likely to incur some additional expenses to open up next year. But for this brief period of time, that's how I thought it looked. So that wraps it up for the May report. Revenues are back to being down just about 1%. Expenditures are running below plan, and the cash balance is up about $18 million over what we have expected, and it stands at the end of May at around $328 million. So if you have any questions, I'll try and answer them.
Thank you for that report, Mr. Treasurer. Before we move forward, are there any questions at this point in time for the Treasurer? Any need for clarity on something? Okay, awesome. Moving on to update on assumptions, let me just kind of introduce this conversation by saying that for the past month and some change now, the Treasurer, myself, Mr. Gooding, and certainly others throughout the district have been having conversation about what to look for moving down the line. If we're looking at this from a SWOT perspective, what are the opportunities and threats? What are those things extraneous to us that we need to consider as budget assumptions moving forward? And subsequent to that, the Treasurer, in his incredible due diligence, worked with Mr. Gooding to develop a set of scenarios that he has presented to us pretty consistently over time. So today's, this portion of the conversation, or the meeting, excuse me, is all focused on those set of scenarios as a part of the update for assumptions. Mr. Treasurer.
Thank you. Yes, and with the beginning of the closure, there was much concern about the economic impact that the closures would have nationally and statewide, and how that might trickle down to the district. So kind of the first topic that came up was really the flip of what I was talking about on the expenditure side, and that was, what's the impact on the state economy? What might that do to the state budget, and how might that trickle down then to the school district? And in the very beginning, we didn't have a whole lot to drive our assumptions, and so we were making kind of A, educated guesses, and B, some scenarios that would at least give us some ballpark, some guardrails, if you will, so that when discussions really began to develop, that when we heard about a certain percentage or dollar amount in reductions, we would already have a feel for its potential impact on the district. And prior to what I shared here in the agenda, I think I ran maybe 9 other different primarily revenue scenarios in terms of what it would be like if there was a 4% reduction or a 10% reduction, and it was 1 year, it was 2 years, and I think some of my colleagues were doing reductions for 21 and the next biennial budget 22 and 23, but bringing funding back in 24. So there were many different permutations of those types of reductions, and I think I counted that I ran it probably maybe 9 of them just to see what they looked like before we got to the point that the superintendent set up her reopening task force, and the subgroup or a working group within that is a budget and finance group that Mr. Gooding and I chair. And it is that group's work that I shared with you in the agenda, and wanted to walk through a little bit with you in terms of what we've looked at and how our information has improved over time. So let me begin again by sharing another screen. So this is a document I prepared for the working group and copied some of this into your agenda. And our scenario started with the base case, which is the May 5-year forecast. The May 5-year forecast, as you know, I prepared back in February before all of this hit the fan. And we proceeded with the forecast, even though we were talking about it in March and April and May for the adoption. We proceeded with the forecast under those original assumptions, knowing full well that we'd have to go through the scenario analysis down the road as the information changed over time. So the first 4 scenarios we ran as a work group were based upon 2 assumptions about revenue and 2 assumptions about expenditures. On the revenue side, we picked a 10% reduction in 21 and then flat thereafter. And these all assume that the 9.2 million comes out in 20 because we knew that at the time. Why'd we pick 10%? Simply because it seems like you always start with what's 10% do to you. And we ran that scenario. That was one of the options under revenue. Then we went a little bit more, and I think it was Dr. Roush in our discussions that first used the word draconian. We went to a more draconian revenue reduction and said 20% in 21 and then 10% flat thereafter. And a couple of things. When I say a 10% reduction and then flat thereafter, because we've assumed that state revenues were flat throughout the forecast, these numbers were a 10% reduction in year 1 that set the new base for all the other years. And it wasn't an additional 10%, but relative to where the forecast was, it was a 10% reduction. So 10% is about $35 million. So when we say a 10% reduction beginning in 21 and flat thereafter, that means that that baseline was reduced $35.5 million every year. So those were the first 2 assumptions. Down 10% in 21, which sets a new base and stays flat and funding is not restored, or down 20 in 21 and then 10 in 22 and then flat. On the expenditure side, we had nothing yet really to drive us as to what the costs might be. Several of us sat down and began on a very preliminary basis to look for, just some sound bites, really. How much might it cost in masks? How much might it cost in hand sanitizer? How much plexiglass do we need? I mean, it just very high level discussions. And interestingly enough, we could come up with pretty close to, somewhere between 50 and $100 million fairly easily. And a 10% reduction, 10% increase in our expenditures is pretty close to $100 million. So 10% kind of fit as a number to at least assess. So the options there that we considered were 10% in just FY21 or a 10% increase in 21 and 22. In other words, plus 100 million in 21 or plus 100 million in 21 and 22. And then after those increases, we would drop back to what the budgets that were submitted for the 5-year forecast. We'd go back to those levels. So these are the combinations that I had, 4 of them. And we ran them a couple of weeks ago, had work group meetings on it, reported back to cabinet on our assessment there. But last Thursday, I had a conversation with some of my treasurer counterparts in several of the largest school districts in the state. And we were joined by a gentleman who previously worked for the Department of Taxation and was a school treasurer and has much better insight on state taxation and funding and budgeting than I do. And he was kind of coming down on the position that the more likely scenario would be a like reduction in 21 that we've seen in 20. In other words, that 9.2 million might set the base for what our funding would be going forward, at least in 21. So I added that as a revenue option, in essence saying that our funding at 21 at the the funding in 20 at the reduced level would be the base, and we would not see any further reduction or restoration of state income for the duration of the forecast, and then combine that with the two expenditure scenarios. What we ended up with was a graph and data that looked like this. And this is one of my infamous hurricane maps. And you can see that the baseline is up here in the gray along here, and that the best alternative scenario we have is the green line, which is these data points here for the green line, and that's scenario 5. And the worst case scenario is scenario 4, and the numbers that correspond run there. And then here's the data table down at the bottom. So you can see that our balances can go anywhere from, in 21 to, our base case was an ending balance of about 245 million in 21, and it was stayed positive throughout the forecast to 24. But the worst case scenario is that we drop down to 66 million in 21, and that deteriorates to a little right around 340 million negative during the life of the forecaster in 24. And certainly when I trend it out into 25, 26, 27, those downward sloping curves simply get worse. All this is designed just to put you in the ballpark, so that you can see how soon that negative balance advances back towards the current year. And as that negative balance comes back and gets closer to us in time, that accelerates the need for us to do one of two things: switch into an expenditure reduction mode, or seek operating millage to increase revenues. I think the most likely now, I feel much more comfortable that scenario 5 is more likely, and that, under scenario 5, we do see a slight deficit in 23 versus the first deficit in our base case was in 25. So we lose a couple of years in terms of where that negative balance is going to be first experienced. But the bottom line is we still don't know. The big issue here now is on the expenditure side, and that's what the reopening task force is working on. They are preparing to have a plan and a report ready by the end of June and out to the board in July. So that will help us know whether our 10% increase is realistic or not. But that's the work we've been doing, somewhat in a fog, but that we get these points of clarity at times where we get better data, and then we reassess that. So that's what we've been doing, and I wanted to just share with you that's the conversation we're having with this task force and in our committee, and how we're using the forecast to do this assessment and prepare ourselves to look at the alternative plans for opening and see where that takes us in the future. Information timing flows, just so you know. The next piece of information, other than getting this report out and what the expenditures look like by the end of June, early part of July, we should know in September with property tax settlements how those go. So September is an important time. I've been told that, there's an old saying, 1 month does not make a trend. So the state budget's experience in March and April don't start to make a trend yet. I've heard that the state would prefer to see 3 to 4 months, so that means at least through June before they see a trend in state revenues. Of course, some of that's exacerbated by the fact that income tax deadline has been pushed to July, so they won't know those numbers until July. Dr. Roush has informed me that we have this thing called an election in November, which may give rise for certain folks to wait until after that point in time to talk about any reductions on state revenues. So I've got expenditures coming at me in July. I've got some better data on real estate taxes in September. Probably by November, I'll have better state numbers. And so that's how that fog will begin to clear and some clarity will be added. And then we head into the spring in January of 21 when the state biennial budget discussions begin. So that's the lay of the land as I see it now. And I thought you'd want to hear that update.
Thank you, Mr. Treasurer. Is it safe to say that based on what you've shown us, what you've come up with, that the timeline, the calendar for us getting more close to the zero, to that zero, as opposed to keep being able to carry over 30 days cash, just sped up?
Mhm.
Your sound is out.
I was trying to be polite and turn that off. Yes, you're absolutely correct. Even under scenario 5, we lose a year in terms of being above 30 days cash. In the base case, we were above 30 days cash until 24, and here we're above 30 days cash until 22. So we kind of lost 2 years in what I would say would be if you asked me to update and submit a revised forecast, it would be scenario 5. And you're right. We're not above 30 days cash in 22.
There you go, which creates an issue when we have to explain what we will do to adjust in those time periods where we are below zero threshold in deficit. Is that correct?
Correct. Right.
All right. Are there any other questions, folks?
Stan, first of all, this is great. I've talked to other school districts around the state, and I think they're a little overwhelmed by everything. So the fact that you're also organized, I think it's just so trying to deal with what we know. Scenario 5, Stan, has that been shared with the levy committee so that they can account for that, or is that even part of the process? Just kind of more of a process question.
You mean the millage committee that we just went through?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yes,
the millage committee had to do with fixed assets, capital budget,
Okay.
than they did necessarily an operating budget. So, and since that committee ended its work and it was a temporary committee, it really doesn't exist anymore. So the answer to your question is no, I've not gone back to that committee and shared it. It's now a matter of this committee, you're the committee I bring this kind of information to, along with that work group under the reopening task force mechanism. But so you're the folks that are going to hear this now.
Okay. Because it sounds like a levy needs to be considered an operating levy, just based on the information we received.
Yeah, and the reason why I hesitate is because there's a significant piece, and that's what Dr. Dixon's team is doing. Mm-hmm. We have to hear about what we need to do to open school in the fall, and they're working on that. So again, this is all about timing. This is the best information I have, and I'm going to wait a couple of weeks, and I'm going to get even better information, and then we're going to wait a couple of weeks and get even better information. You know, I can't even remember because the information's been changing so rapidly, but probably 4 weeks ago, I talked to banks about the potential for a cash flow borrowing in July. I had state revenue reductions. I didn't know what they were going to be. I had a delay in property tax collections, and I didn't know the impact of that. And at that point, I didn't think bills were going out till July, so advances wouldn't have come in. Well, since that time, I know what my state revenue reduction is. You know, I originally estimated that to be 13 to 14 million. It ended up being 9.2, and then they also reduced my charter school reduction about $1.7 million. So I had a $7.5 million cash flow issue, not a 9. And now the tax bills went out this week. I believe is what I believe that's. I've not checked yet, but I was told they were going out this week. And I have a advance schedule that says I can get advances in July. So that changed that whole picture. So just today's Wednesday, just yesterday, I talked to the banks and said, we're putting that on hold. I don't believe I'm going to borrow in July. I'm going to wait. I got a board meeting in August. If July turns out to be bad, I have to. So what I'm saying is this is so inordinately fluid. You know, I get up in the, you get up in the morning and you read the front page of the paper, although unfortunately that's a day late now too, given their deadlines to print, but you get up and you're hit in the morning with some new information. So this changes a lot. But the next big key is wait for the reopening task force data to come out for me and see if we're looking at, you know, 50 million, 100 million. How does the CARES Act money fit into all of that? How many of those expenditures can be covered by that? So it'll be very fluid, and we're working, you know, kind of on the fly every day. And I appreciate the fact you say that it looks organized. If you were part of the conversations with Mike and Scott and me and Eric and others, it was a little, you know, there's an old story about watching sausage being made. It was a little chaotic, but we got it. It was good to get it boiled down to a half a dozen different scenarios. It was that, I think that's helpful.
Yes, I thank you for that, Treasurer, because you're absolutely correct. It really is all about timing. It was interesting, the conversation that we had while I'm in my garage talking to you a month ago about the possibility of having to leverage additional bond dollars to, you know, float us. Now looking at where we are now, how the calendar is kind of sped up for us. But yes, this is all about the academic plan, the academic set of priorities that are going to be established from this task force moving forward, that deal with everything from blended academics on-site and off-site to any number of things that we're trying to ensure for our students. And then we have to be responsible for those who are not our students, whether they are parochial or charter. So it's a heck of a segue. If everything is good to go, it's a heck of a segue into our temporary appropriations discussion. Mr. Gooding, are you ready?
I'm ready, Chairman Cole.
Right.
Yeah, no, that those questions are exactly why I think we have talked with the committee in the past. What we have proposed to the administration is moving forward with a temporary appropriation for FY21 due to all of these things that we're talking about now. We don't know what's going to happen at the state level with potential budget cuts. We don't know yet what the recommendations and the result of the work with the reopening school task force are going to be. There's just a lot of pieces moving that we don't have answers to. So what we are proposing to do is move forward with a temporary appropriation that would be approved. Our recommendation, and I think it's on the agenda, that we would like to do that at the June 30th meeting, approve a temporary appropriation, and explain the differences with this. On the general fund side, we are proposing to allocate budgets for schools and buildings at the current level for FY20. So they'll have everything they do. A couple adjustments in there, specifically one to call out is for textbook purchase. We need that to move forward. If we wait, it's too late. We can't have those things ordered in time for when kids, in fact, do come back to school. So we need to move forward with that. The current budget for FY20 for textbooks is a mere $100,000. That's not going to buy a whole lot of books. The request for next year was at 7.1 million. So we are going to move forward with that as part of the temporary appropriation. The board is required to adopt a final appropriation no later than October 1st. So what we would do is as the committee's done in the past, we'll continue our work through June. We'll continue our work into July. We will come to FAC in August with presentations by all of the department administrators presenting their requests, their final request for next year in August. And then we'll take that to the board in September for approval on the general fund side. Everything else will be as has been normal, I guess, if there is such a thing. Another piece that's causing the delay, typically by now we've received grant allocations for our state and federal grants from the Ohio Department of Education by now. We will not receive that information until next Monday at the earliest. So giving us a little additional time from what was planned for June 16th until June 30th, we'll have all the updated information we can at that time so we can put those in. Those are very restricted revenue sources coming in with very restricted uses of those funds. So that's not like, those numbers aren't going to change much. But we'll have those at the full level of appropriation for FY21. It's the temporary piece that is essentially for the general fund piece on the general fund side.
Mr.
I
Gunning,
did include.
can I ask a question? I'm
Yes,
sorry. And putting those CARES Act dollars into perspective, you know, a lot of folks may hear $26 million and think that that's a lot of money. And I imagine under any number of circumstances, especially if you hit the lottery, it certainly is a lot of money. But when you think about what our appropriations are per annum, can you just help frame that just a little bit more?
Yes, our total appropriation is $1.5 billion. As Chairman Cole mentioned, the CARES Act, the total allocation, there's two allocations that you may see out there. One is 30.9 million, which is the total district allocation. Approximately 3 million of that is earmarked specifically for the non-public auxiliary schools. So we're working with those folks. It's based on the Title I allocation that we receive, and that's how those funds are being distributed. The use of those funds will be directly tied to the work of the Reopening School Task Force. Now, for example, as Michael said, to keep in perspective here, if a result of that work is we're going to buy a device, we're going to buy a $300 Chromebook for all 50,000 of our students. That right there is $15 million. So that, even though 27 million sounds like a lot, half of that could be eaten up right away in one device for every kid. We also have needs for hand sanitizer, for masks, all kinds of, for signage that we have, the plexiglass between the cubicles. There's a lot of stuff that's going to come out of that, in addition to how we deliver instruction when the kids and staff come back. You know, is it a blended learning? Is it all virtual, online? What's it going to look like? And that's the work we're doing right now. So there may be a blending, if you will, of the funding source to do that work, because honestly, $27 million in CARES Act money may not cover everything that we think is going to happen as a part of the Reopening Schools Task Force. So that's why we've got some, as part of the scenarios that Stan presented, we've got some numbers in there, some just estimates until we get those plans that we can pull that all together and figure out how we're going to fund that.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question for Mr. Gooding. Mr. Gooding, so the textbooks purchase, that is those are virtual textbooks then?
It's as I understand it, it's obviously we're looking to get the physical textbooks themselves, but there is a digital component to that, as well as a component for the professional development for the staff on how to deliver that.
Okay, I guess.
The breakdown of that, I unfortunately I don't have that off the top of my head for you.
Okay, I mean, for me, I think my overall question, and maybe the task force will answer this, if we're moving to one-to-one devices for students, why would we then need physical textbooks if we're moving one-to-one and every student's going to have a device? And would it save us money if we did not purchase the physical textbooks and did the virtual textbooks only? I wouldn't. And maybe the task force will be able to come up with something that I'm not thinking about with that. But if we're moving to one-to-one, I would think virtual would probably, may save us money, may not, I'm not sure, but that's a question that I would ask.
Okay, no, that's a great question. I'll make sure I follow up with Dr. Ocasio so that we get that information to you before it comes to the board for approval on June 30th.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
I don't see Chairman. There he is. Now I see.
I'm here.
There, now I see. Okay. You had me worried there. I thought I was going to have to take over, and I sure didn't want to do that.
Oh, I just had to step away for a quick second. Have you concluded, Mr. Gooding?
Yeah, just see if there's any question or feedback, concerns that anybody from the committee may have about what we're proposing.
If there are no questions, what I also wanted to do was, I thought because of this, it's really important that this committee put this forward with its blessing. I know that a lot of this work has already been in progress, but I thought it was important, particularly considering that we're looking at wrapping things up by June 30, end of fiscal year. I wanted to make sure that we were able to move this temporary appropriations piece forward with our approval, with our stamp of support. How would we, Mr. Treasurer, would we develop a motion to say approving this temporary appropriations?
Yes, I had proposed in the agenda that the committee adopt a resolution recommending to the Board of Education that the temporary appropriations resolution for fiscal year 2021 be presented to the board for consideration and adoption at the board's June 30th meeting. That's what I wrote up as an idea for this committee to, as you said, kind of put your stamp of approval and push that forward to the board that way.
So is this language in that we could actually motion for today?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So is there a motion to approve the resolution?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
All right. Thank you very much. That is Mr. Miller and
Mr. Green.
Mr. Green. Okay, I don't see you on my screen. Okay, awesome. Are we ready for a vote?
Roll call. All right. Mr. Cole.
Yes.
Mr. Green.
Yes.
Ms. Johnson.
Yes.
Mr. Miller.
Yes.
Mr. Ragland.
Yes.
And Mr. Brown.
Yes.
Thank you. That motion carried.
Thank you, Mr. Treasurer. Thank you, committee, for that. Oh, Lord have mercy. I tuned myself out. Forgive me, you all. Juggling so many things at one time. So moving on to our WCBE and latchkey funds transfer discussion.
Yep. Stan, you want me to take that?
Well, yeah, I'll just, my only preface is, part of the budget discussions, we've had presentations. Scott has brought presentations on what we call our enterprise funds, those that are self-sustaining funds. WCBE, latchkey funds, adult ed, and the food service fund come to my mind as the four enterprise funds you've heard from. There are two funds. You know the situation with WCBE fairly well, but with the closure and the fact that latchkey could not operate, but we did maintain the staffing. They are, at least in the near term, having a cash flow shortage issue, and that's going to require a transfer of some amount, like WCBE, to help subsidize those operations, and that's what Scott's pulled together for us now.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. On board docs, I did copy links to the May 13th FAC meeting where they came in and gave presentations. And just a quick refresher for the latchkey program, the estimate at that time was that they were going to end the fiscal year, which would be June 30th, with a deficit of approximately $300,000. and WCBE was projecting a deficit in the amount of $873,000. So with the information that we have now, we still have a couple more weeks of processing and additional payroll to go through and register on the books. At this point, our estimates are that for Latchkey, we're probably going to end a little bit better. It's a little bit closer to $191,000, $200,000 deficit as opposed to $300,000. So $100,000 delta there. So that will be good news as best we can we can share. On WCB, it's very close. We projected $873,000 deficit, and right now it's looking around $856,000 to $860,000 deficit. So we're pretty much right on target with where we thought that was going to be. We did want to share that with the committee because we will take a transfer to the Board of Education at the June 30th meeting to transfer funds from the general fund to cover these deficits once all the actuals are in.
And just so the committee understands, there are two types of kind of what I call balance sheet activities that we do to aid or assist other funds on the books. One is an advance, and you see that, and you hear me talk about that in the other expenditures category. But advances and transfers. Advances are truly what that word means. We advance dollars in to help with the cash flow situation, and then it gets returned to us at a later point in time. And you're allowed to do those, during the year or over year end. Transfers, on the other hand, are more permanent. You're actually making the move of those funds from one fund to another on a permanent basis with no expectation of that being repaid. So in this particular case, we are looking at transfers, not advances. So just so you know the difference in that terminology.
Thank you for that clarity, Mr. Treasurer. Are there any questions at this point or comments? Mr. Brown? Have to turn your mic on.
No, none from me. If I could make this item disappear from our workload, I would, but I can't.
I thank you for that. It is duly noted. And I will kind of piggyback on that statement to say that, Mr. Varner has really been given a kind of timeline that is tied to the superintendent's I think it's 2023 or 2022 timeline. So, he's working diligently, I do know, on getting an idea of what the value of the station is and being able to give us that current information, in addition to some idea around very clear direction and vision for the station that also includes utilization of academic programs within the district. I know that this has been an ongoing priority for the board for some time. So here's kind of this last shot at this last bite at the apple, if you will, but also on the counter side to give us the idea of what the value is so that we can make a fiscal decision appropriately moving forward. So thank you for that. Any questions about the latchkey funds piece?
Mr. Chairman, my question is about WCBE. Who all is on Mr. Varner's committee?
He has a number of folks, and I don't have that information in front of me. I do know that a number of community participants, some are like Don McTighe. There are a few folks in the community and elsewhere who he's brought together over the last couple of years to convene this revisioning committee, so to speak. We can make sure we get that information turned around to you very quickly. Anything else? I see your wheels turning.
Michael, I was surprised a moment ago to hear Don McTighe's name, since he's got multiple interests and may have conflicts. Certainly, he's an appropriate person that we may want to be consulting with and talking to. But I hope that I'm not hearing that he's part of a decision-making or even a recommending committee for what we do.
So I won't say him specifically. I just attended an event that we hosted where I saw him there. I know that he is a part of a community group that had been interested and in fact submitted proposal to the district
Right.
to manage the station and quite possibly even purchase it.
Right.
So I don't know. Let's get that information from
Fine.
Mr. Varner, just for clarity's sake.
Yeah. And might as well get the rest of the name of any committee as well.
I'll make sure that we turn it around quickly. I'll get with Misty on that. I thank you all for those questions. Again, if there's nothing on the latchkey piece, this is nothing that is necessary for us to move forward, is it, in terms of a resolution?
I do have a question around latchkey.
Yes.
Moving forward, Mr. Chairman, I guess my question is not necessarily for you, it will probably be for the superintendent. If we are moving, and I know that one of the options is a K through 12 robust virtual academy all year, if we're moving to that for next year, what happens with the latchkey program?
Well, if parents prefer that, then we won't have it. There will be no need for a latchkey program if we're totally virtual.
Thank you both.
But yeah, but remember there are two options. So we're surveying parents to see which option they prefer. So if parents prefer the blended model, then there may be a latchkey program. But again, remember there's going to be new guidelines associated possibly with that program, which may increase our cost for that program. So we're looking at a number of things that we will provide the board with an update regarding if we're going to move forward with it or not. But we have to look at all our options and our costs and know that with the new guidelines, we will not be able to have currently, I think we have 18:1 as our student teacher ratio, and that will not be the case moving forward with the current health guidelines.
Thank you, Madam Superintendent.
That ratio would change, Madam Superintendent, to a 50% threshold.
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah, right now that's what it's looking like. And again, you know, we're following all the CDC guidelines as we make those decisions. We're reopening, and that program will be affected as well. Yeah. So even if we move forward with it, we may not be able to offer it at all of our sites, or may have to, you know, but it will be a cost associated, just like with the other plans moving forward.
Well, if I could suggest, and there's another question coming in. Well, this question is from Madam President Carson. How many staff members do we have at the radio station? And if that is sold or closed, what will happen to those employees? Don't have to answer right now, but would like an answer by next week, please. So I'll make sure if we can make sure that question is forwarded to the appropriate staff for answering, Madam Superintendent. I'd like to get an answer to Ms. Carson on that.
We can get that, and I think that's kind of, yes, we'll get that answer. Okay.
I just want to throw out to you that this kind of old axiom I learned many years ago. I heard it from a convicted felon. He said that chances make champions. I think that this is a very unique opportunity for us to develop a early childhood, pre-K, K through 6 kind of platform that creates a safe space for families that need it with the right conditions in play. I think that this is a heck of an opportunity to invite partners to the table to possibly look into helping us fund the gap and increase the viability of the program for Latchkey. So just my 2 cents, but I'd love to see what comes from your recommendations moving forward that hopefully include those things.
Yeah.
So if there aren't any other questions, okay. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved. Second.
Awesome.
All
Roll
right.
call, Mr. Treasurer.
Mr. Green,
Yes.
Ms. Johnson,
Yes.
Mr. Miller,
Yes.
Mr. Ragland,
Yes.
Mr. Brown,
Yes.
and Chairman Cole.
Yes.
You are
Thank you.
adjourned.
Thank you all so much
Thank
for
you.
attending. I hope that you guys get settled in. I think there's supposed to be a bad storm coming through this evening. So I
Yep.
hope everybody stays well and healthy. Look forward to seeing you again. And thank you so much for your contributions.
Thank
Thank you.
you.